Here we go. John chapter 4. Verse 1 is actually just a small part of a sentence. It says, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard he was making and baptizing more disciples than John. That's the end. I'm going to keep reading for a minute. There's a parenthetical statement. It says, though Jesus himself was not baptizing, but his disciples were. Verse 3, he left Judea and went again to Galilee. That's really the first sentence, but let's just look at this first part. When Jesus had learned that the Pharisees had heard he was making and baptizing more disciples than John. It might be easy to look at this and say, well, this is just giving us a time and a setting. This happened when Jesus had heard these things, but it does alert us that the Pharisees, the religious leaders, are aware of the kind of disciples that John was making and baptizing, and now the kind of disciples that Jesus' ministry was making. Disciples are followers. Jesus now has a growing amount of followers, and those followers were being baptized. It says right here, now the next verse is going to talk about Jesus not doing the baptizing, but his disciples, but that does tell us quite a bit. It should cause us to ask questions. What did this baptism look like? Was Jesus talking about the death and burial that we would encounter with Christ and the resurrection we would have? Maybe, I suspect, I hope. We find out later in the book of Acts, there's some disciples running around. They were part of John the Baptist ministry, and in that ministry, they had learned a bunch of stuff. They went out and traveled, and they were baptizing into John's baptism for repentance of sin. And then some of Jesus' disciples encounter them and say, hey, have you ever heard of the baptism of Jesus Christ? And they said, no. And so they instruct him in something more, and it's like a bigger thing. And so, it's not like they could easily communicate back then. Things were traveling by word of mouth. So that one baptism was then being replaced by another one. But here we read that Jesus, his ministry and his disciples were baptizing, and it was significant enough that the Pharisees were hearing about it, which means those disciples were probably making a proclamation of what they had heard and learned from Jesus.